Hello, everybody. I'm Luiz Eduardo Oliveira, professor of the Federal University of Sergipe, Brazil. I'm here to talk about empire and language, Pombal and the law of the directory. The first Pombaline piece of legislation regarding language teaching is the directory law. In what is perhaps one of the most important linguistic policy documents of the 18th century, due to its length and richness of historical information, the main aspects of Pombaline legislation are here present. The discursive construction of the notion of a polished and civilized Europe, which is opposed to supposed delay in temporal administration and Jesuit pedagogy, anti-Jesuitism, we could say, regalism, which presents itself as a paradoxical union between civil society, the absolutist state, and the Christian faith, modern pedagogy, of which one of the main features is the smoothness of the method, in contrast to the punishments and rigor of traditional teaching, and finally, historical self awareness, which unfolds in the invention of a tradition of the Lusitanian people, thus going back to the times of colonization in the 16th century. The first paragraph of the law sets out their immediate motivations: the temporal administration of the Jesuits over the Indians of the villages of the state of Grão Pará and Maranhão, and the incapacity of the principals of those villages to govern them. Thus, it was necessary to propose means of civility. Such competence should fall to a director who would be appointed by the governor and captain general of the state. Such a director should have the following requirements: good customs, zeal, prudence, truth, and, most important of all, science of the language. The third paragraph established the director's two main objectives: Christianizing and civilizing. As for the first objective, Christianization, would be under the responsibility of the prelate of the diocese, as it is a purely spiritual matter. Regarding the second objective, the civility of the Indians, which would be under the exclusive competence of the directors, the first measure to be taken was to establish the mandatory use of the lingua do príncipe. The text of the sixth paragraph presents two movements. The first concerns the Enlightenment concept of the polished nation, or civilized, insofar as it denounces the legislator's will to place the Kingdom of Portugal in the condition of a nation just like the other polished nations of the world. In this way, the state would have to use a national language, the language of the prince, to assert itself before others, the other nations, and the conquered peoples, thus building a national identity. The second movement refers to the obstacle that would have been faced for the imposition of the Portuguese language, the general language. For the legislator, it was a truly abominable and diabolical invention of the Jesuits. The Directory Law took a first step towards the constitution of Portuguese as a national language, something made possible by its grammatization, as Ohu says, and schooling, which served as support for the construction of a Portuguese national identity, which could only be consolidated, in the view of the legislator, through the systematic erasure of the entire linguistic variety, then prohibiting boys and girls, as well as the indigenous populations, from using the language of their nations, or the so-called general. As the lingua do príncipe was the fundamental basis of civility, the creation of two public schools was determined in all villages, one for boys and another for girls, in which the masters should teach the Christian doctrine, reading, writing, and counting, in the form which is practiced in all schools of civilized nations. In girls' schools, counting would be replaced by spinning, making lace, sewing, and more ministries proper to the sex. Other guidelines were established for the directors as a means of civilizing the Indians. Thus, they should watch over the maintenance of the privileges of the Indians who might occupy honorary posts, such as those of ordinary judges, counselors, and principals. In the same way, the nickname of blacks when referring to the Indians was strictly forbidden, as was the custom, since the vileness of such a name could persuade them that nature had destined them for slaves of the whites, as was regularly the case of the blacks of the coast of Africa. In this way, the directors would have the task of treating the Indians as if they were whites, introducing them to the same last names and surnames of the families of Portugal, and advising them to build their houses in imitation of the whites, making different divisions in them where families live with separation, and to dress decently in proportion to their qualities or positions. To combat the addiction of drunkenness, the directors should use both efficient and smooth means. One interesting thing is that the law also encourages the introduction of whites in the villages for the legitimation of miscegenation between whites and Indians only, and an increase of the civilian population. Recent historiography has shown that, despite of the intention of the law, the civilization of the Indians was tied to colonization and the relations established between the two peoples. The Indians appear to be entirely dependent on the action of the colonizer. Besides, the application of the Pombaline indigenous policy, instead of the mere transposition of what determined the paragraphs of the directory, was a dynamic process largely conditioned by several factors, either by local specificities or by the performance of the Indians, who could act out of their interests. It's a very interesting thing that the Indians, despite the alleged equality sought by the directory, in many situations used ethnicity as a political instrument. Therefore, the collective action of the Indians living around common objectives showed that the directory, rather than a simple imposition, was influenced by the constant interaction between indigenous peoples and indigenous politics. One very curious case is that of the Padre Manuel da Penha do Rosário, who wrote in 1773 a pamphlet consisting of 19 questions with their respective answers addressed to the Inquisition court. But curiously enough, he could convince them that he did not break either the law of the church or the real law by teaching the Indians in general language. A key to understand the application of the law of the directory was suggested by Banha de Andrade, who made available a true finding of the Overseas Historical Archive in the Pernambuco box, a brief instruction to teach Christian doctrine as well as the principles of the Portuguese language in its orthography, in a letter similar to the text of the directory corrected by Luiz Diogo Lobo da Silva. It is a catechism used as a primer for the teaching of the language, in the same way as the then existing ones. Although the motivations of the law of the directory were of a much more political and economic order than linguistic, we know that such document was of fundamental importance for the consolidation of Portuguese as a national language in Portugal and Brazil, mainly because it consolidates the role of catechism as a fundamental device in the schooling process and as a method of teaching the first letters. In the 17th century, catechism was no longer the master's book, but the pupil's, and it contained the alphabet, the syllable pictures, the prayers. With the permit of September 30, 1770, the teaching of Portuguese grammar became official, since, from then on, teachers of Latin grammar were obliged, during the first 6 months, to instruct students in the Portuguese grammatical art composed by Antônio José dos Reis Lobato. The law of 1770 has an undeniable importance in the process of institutionalizing the teaching of the Portuguese language in Portugal and its domains, with inevitable consequences for the institution of the General Law of October 15, 1827 in Brazil, which ordered the creation of schools of first letters in all the cities, towns, and most populous places of the empire. Thank you very much.